When planned economies have to deal with the transmission of information, they face what I'll call the impossible task. What is the impossible task? The impossible task is figuring out how much of each good and service should be provided in the year, and who should have access to that good and service. And at the same time, for each good and service, figuring out who should produce or provide it. Now, why is this an impossible task? It's because everything's part of a complicated network. So let's take bicycles. Right? Suppose we're deciding how many people should be able to ride a bicycle in the next year, and which ones they are, and therefore how many new bicycles will be needed. Well, that's a tough question. It depends on several things. It depends on how many people need to go long distances versus who can simply walk everywhere. It depends on the availability of other modes of transportation, automobiles, public transportation, and all of those depend on things like gasoline, right, versus skilled drivers for buses, etc. It also requires us to know how difficult or easy it is to produce each of the components. Right? Now, one of the things bicycles might typically require is steel. Actually, I should correct that. You might be able to use steel sometimes and aluminum other times. Sometimes it might be a choice. So you've got to know whether it's better to use steel or aluminum. Right? And of course, you also have to know the availability of both steel and aluminum. Right? Let's say it's very clear that aluminum is not going to be a good idea. Well, you have to know about the availability of steel. Right? Actually, to decide whether aluminum is a good idea, you have to know about the availability of steel. Well, how do we know about the availability of steel? Well, we'd have to know about how much steel can be produced. Actually, let's correct that. You have to know about how much steel can be produced, but you also have to know about all of the other uses for steel. Okay? But of course, what we're doing here is not looking at the absolute demand for each. We're looking at how important it is, right, given a possible available supply of steel. We have to look at how important bicycles are as opposed to new building construction, or cars, or buses, or everything else that you use steel for. So what's the difficulty there? Well, the difficulty is we're comparing the needs. But of course, just as the need for bicycles is dependent on things about alternatives, right? The need for each of these things involved in steel, that use steel, depends on the relevant alternatives for those, which partly depends on other materials. And labor, right? Now, we can go on. We can say, okay, well, let's look at the availability of steel. Well, that depends on the availability partly of iron, right? And of the factories needed to produce steel. But we have to know what other things could those resources be used for rather than steel, right? So you notice this is multiplying, right? And at each time it multiplies, it leads to 50 or 60 new questions. But each of those 50 or 60 new questions has an answer that's partly dependent on the other questions. So what Friedman says is you'd have to have a picture of all possible uses of all possible resources and all possible needs in order to get an accurate assessment of any one commodity. And that can't be done. Nobody can have that amount of information. Right? First of all, because it's too much. And second, because it involves predictions about the future. You'd have to know whether there'd be floods in iron-producing regions next year. But you can't predict that perfectly, so you don't know when there's going to be a shortage of iron. So if you imagine a centralized planning bureau that's trying to figure out what everyone can produce and consume in the next year in the most just and fair and economically effective way, they can't do it. It's too much information for anyone to handle. So there's no way they're going to get close to the right answers. According to Friedman, that's why planned economies don't work. They can't transmit information, right? All the information needs to be transmitted to and processed by a centralized bureau, right? Some kind of centralized agency, but no individual, no agency can possibly handle that level of information.